It was supposed to be a simple rinse, just a few minutes under hot water to wash off the overwhelming smell of bleach that had soaked into her skin and hair during the late shift. Ava didn't plan to stay long, didn't expect comfort, and certainly didn't expect anyone to notice. The suite looked unoccupied. The system said the room was still available, and the door had been left slightly open. Her uniform was damp, her forearm stung from a minor chemical burn, and her shoes made soft, squishing sounds with every step as she entered Suite 3201. No one had answered when she knocked twice out of habit, and in her mind she was invisible, just another cleaning girl in a hotel that didn't know her name. The bathroom felt like another world, too quiet, too beautiful, too personal to belong to a space that should have been temporary. The light was warm and low, the towels folded like clouds on silver racks, and beside the large soaking tub, there was a small, unopened bottle of body wash, labeled in cursive, White Jasmine. Ava held it for a moment, turning it between her fingers, then unscrewed the cap. The scent hit her immediately, soft and familiar, like the memory of a place she couldn't name. Her breath caught slightly, and she stood very still, the bottle still in her hand. Something about the fragrance tugged at her. Not just nostalgia, but a sense of longing so deep it made her dizzy. She poured a little into the water, then more, watching it swirl and bloom like mist over the surface. She undressed quickly, self-conscious even in an empty room, and stepped into the tub, the water stinging lightly at first, where the chemicals had touched her skin, but then warmth began to take over, easing into her muscles, and she exhaled, her head resting against the edge. For the first time that week, maybe that month, she let herself stop. No noise, no harsh lights, no demands, just water, heat, and the scent of something that felt safe. Her eyes closed. She wasn't sure how long she drifted like that, half asleep, held by steam and quiet, but everything changed when she heard the click of a door. At first, she didn't move, thinking maybe it was just the wind or the distant creak of the building, but then footsteps came, soft and heavy, growing closer across the marble tiles. She opened her eyes. There was a man standing at the bathroom doorway, soaked from the rain, his coat dripping onto the floor, his face unreadable. He didn't shout, didn't react with anger or alarm. He simply stood there, staring, and for a moment she wasn't sure if he was real. His gaze moved slowly from her face to the tub, then to the open bottle on the edge, the scent hanging thick in the air between them. His lips parted as if to speak, but he only managed a whisper, barely audible. She froze, clutching the towel to her chest, her voice lost in her throat. Her mouth opened to apologize, but nothing came out. The man took one step forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief or pain. His voice, when it finally came again, was raw. "That scent," he said, so quietly it almost disappeared into the hum of the room. "It was the one she always wore, the last thing I smelled before she was gone." Ava didn't understand, not yet. She only saw the way his shoulders fell, and how he looked not at her but through her, as if her presence had cracked open something he had locked away for years. Eva Clark had never meant to stand out, not in a place like this, not in a world where the silent ones were the easiest to ignore. She moved quietly through her days, blending into back hallways, slipping into service elevators her name rarely called, her face rarely remembered. At 23, she had learned how to disappear, how to fold herself into corners and carry the weight of responsibility without complaint. Since her mother died 2 years ago, she had worked almost every day, juggling part-time shifts at a daycare and full-time hours cleaning rooms at the Sinclair Grand Hotel, one of Boston's most luxurious high-rises, where the windows touched clouds and the air always smelled like polish and money. She never spoke of the brother she cared for alone, a boy of 9 who barely spoke and never made eye contact, nor of the sketches she hid in the back of her notebook, pages filled with quiet sadness and colorless dreams, drawn between shifts when the world wasn't looking. Suite 3201 was a place she had only seen from the hallway, a floor reserved for VIP clients, billionaires, and people who didn't blink at paying $10,000 a night. Ava had once pressed her hand against the thick mahogany door just to feel the weight of it, wondering what kind of life was lived behind it. What kind of person could afford to float that far above reality? She never imagined she'd be in the center of it, soaking wet, half-naked, and staring into the eyes of the man who owned the entire building. But even then, in that moment of confusion and fear, there was something in his eyes that stopped her from running. Nathaniel Gray hadn't been seen publicly in nearly 3 years. His photos used to appear regularly in Forbes and Fortune, a tall figure with steel gray eyes and impeccably tailored suits, the face of Greystone Holdings and the kind of man who seemed built from marble, untouched by grief or error. But that changed the day his wife, Grace Marlowe, died unexpectedly from a rare cardiac condition. She was 31, an interior designer known for her warmth and for bringing life to every space she touched. After her death, Nathaniel vanished from the public eye, withdrew from meetings, stopped attending galas, and relocated to Europe without announcement. His silence became its own kind of myth. Some said he'd gone mad with sorrow, others that he'd sold his shares and was living on a yacht in Greece. No one expected him to return quietly one gray morning and check into his own hotel under no name at all. But that's exactly what he did. He had taken the elevator to the 32nd floor, ignoring the curious glance of the bellhop, and entered Suite 3201 for the first time since Grace's death. It had remained untouched, exactly as she left it, down to the small bottle of white jasmine body wash she had insisted on having specially made for that particular bathroom. The scent was delicate, never overpowering, but it was her. It lingered on her clothes, her hair, their sheets, and in his memory it was the last thing he clung to the night they took her away. He hadn't smelled it since, not until today, not until he opened the door and found a stranger in the bath, the steam rising around her like the ghost of a dream, her shoulders curled slightly inward, her eyes closed as if the world outside had finally disappeared. For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't breathe. He couldn't. The image before him didn't make sense, didn't belong in the timeline of his life, and yet it pierced something sharp and fragile inside him. The girl looked nothing like Grace, but the shape of the moment, the warmth of the room, the scent, God, the scent, it all came rushing back. The past, the last night they spent together, the way she laughed when he spilled wine on the hotel rug, the way she fell asleep with the window open just so the breeze could carry that fragrance through the room. His chest tightened as if memory had grown claws. Ava still hadn't spoken. She was afraid, not just of being fired, but of whatever pain she had stepped into without meaning to. She tried to gather herself, to say something polite, to explain, but the man standing across from her didn't seem angry. He seemed broken, and somehow, in the silence between them, they both realized something strange. This wasn't about trespassing, and it wasn't about blame. It was about something unspoken that now hung in the air with the scent of white jasmine, something neither of them had expected to find again. The hours that followed were a blur, not of noise or confrontation, but of silence so deep it felt like a secret neither of them had asked to share. Ava had left the suite quietly after muttering a soft apology, clutching her clothes to her chest, her cheeks flushed with both embarrassment and confusion. She expected the call from management to come within minutes, expected her badge to be deactivated by the end of the shift, but nothing happened. She finished cleaning 2 more rooms on a lower floor, folding towels with trembling fingers, all the while replaying the moment in her head the way he had looked at her, not with anger, but with something else, something cracked and uncertain, something that didn't feel like judgment. When she finished her shift, she slipped out the back entrance as always, into the gray drizzle that still clung to the city. Boston in October was a wash of cold wind and amber leaves, and as she crossed the street toward the subway, her thoughts were a tangle of scent and silence. She didn't know his name. She hadn't recognized his face. He hadn't introduced himself, and yet the weight of his stare had settled in her bones. It wasn't until later that night, while scrolling through her cracked phone in the tiny apartment she shared with her younger brother, that she saw the name in a headline: Nathaniel Gray, hotel magnate, seen returning to Boston. The article showed an older photo: sharp suit, polished hair, no smile. She didn't even notice the man in the picture. Her eyes stopped instead on the woman beside him, Grace. Even in the grainy image, the warmth in her eyes was unmistakable. Ava stared at the picture for minutes, her chest tight. It wasn't that the woman looked familiar, it was the necklace she wore. A small charm, shaped like a crescent moon, exactly like the one Ava used to draw over and over as a child without knowing why. She didn't sleep much that night. The next morning she was shocked to find her name still on the schedule. No warning, no meeting, just another workday, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. She kept her head down, worked faster than usual, and avoided the top floor, until her manager stopped her near the supply closet and handed her an envelope. Inside was a single note, written in neat cursive: lunch, 1 p.m., rooftop garden. No signature. No instructions. Just the scent of faint jasmine left behind on the paper. She almost didn't go. She almost threw the note away, convinced it had to be a mistake. But curiosity did something strange to her. It softened her fear. So she went. The rooftop garden was quiet. The rain had passed, and the air smelled of damp stone and early autumn roses. She found him sitting on a bench near the edge, looking out over the skyline. His posture was casual, but there was tension in his shoulders, as if the wind carried something too heavy for words. He gestured to the seat beside him, and for a long moment they said nothing. Then, slowly he turned to her. "I didn't expect anyone to be in that room," he said, voice low, almost apologetic. "No one's used it in 3 years." Ava nodded, unsure what to say. She felt out of place, still wearing her faded uniform, still smelling faintly of cleaning products. But he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and it didn't matter. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "Before she died, Grace told me something strange. She said if one day I came across someone unexpected, someone who made me stop and feel again, I should invite them to live a normal day with me, just one. No money, no titles, no grief. Just a day," she said. "Pretend it's the last one we get." Ava frowned slightly, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her, not with pity, but with quiet recognition. "Because you didn't flinch," he said. "You didn't scream or apologize 100 times. You looked at me like I was human, not a headline. And because you chose that scent." "It just felt familiar," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. He nodded. "It was hers. She had it made special for that room. I haven't smelled it since the night she passed." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. He asked her again, gently, "Would you give me that day?" Ava hesitated, thinking of her brother, her schedule, the risks, the consequences. But something inside her, something quiet and persistent, said yes, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because she too hadn't felt anything in a long time. And for reasons she couldn't explain, being near him didn't scare her. They met the next morning in the lobby. She wore a simple gray coat and the only pair of jeans she owned that didn't have holes in the knees. He greeted her with a soft nod, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. No driver, no assistants, just the 2 of them and a day. Their first stop was a small cafe near the river where Grace used to write in the mornings. Nathaniel didn't speak much as they sat by the window, but he watched Ava carefully as she stirred sugar into her cup, her fingers sketching invisible shapes on the table. He noticed the way she looked at the light, how she closed her eyes for a second longer than necessary when the breeze carried in a new scent. From there, they walked to a used bookstore tucked into a quiet street. She found a second-hand sketchbook, and he bought it without comment, handing it to her like it was the most natural thing in the world. Later, they walked through the sculpture garden where Grace had designed a bench shaped like a wave. Ava ran her hand over the curve of the stone, saying softly, "I've seen this before." Nathaniel asked where. She didn't know, maybe in a dream, maybe in a memory she never claimed, maybe in the lines of a drawing she had once made without understanding why. They had lunch at a food truck near the harbor, fish tacos eaten standing up with the sun on their faces. They laughed once, at something small, something silly. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't hurt, the kind that didn't feel borrowed. Ava watched him closely during those moments, the way his mouth softened, the way his eyes searched the air like he was trying to remember something important that had nothing to do with loss. In the late afternoon, they sat on the edge of the esplanade, shoes off, toes just touching the cold river water. He told her stories then, not of boardrooms or business, but of Saturday mornings with Grace, of arguments over how to arrange books, of the way she used to hum while brushing her hair. Ava listened, not because she was supposed to, but because something in her needed those stories, like puzzle pieces that somehow belonged to her too. As the sky turned amber, she pulled the sketchbook from her bag and drew quietly, just lines, nothing defined. He leaned in once, curious, and she didn't pull away. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she replied. "Maybe just the shape of a day that wasn't wasted." He said nothing, but his fingers brushed lightly against hers, a moment of contact so brief it barely counted as touch, and yet she felt it long after the sun had dipped below the skyline. When the day ended, they didn't say goodbye. They didn't make promises. They stood in the hotel elevator side by side, watching the numbers light up in descending order, and when the doors opened, she stepped out first. Just before they closed again, she turned and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, and the doors slid shut. Back in her apartment, she stared at the sketch she had started. It was still unfinished, still fragile, but in it were two figures sitting beside a river, their reflections clearer than the sky above them, the scent of jasmine lingering on the paper like a memory she could almost believe was real. The morning after their shared day unfolded like every other for Ava, with the dull alarm of her phone vibrating against the thin mattress, the distant hum of traffic below, and the quiet movements of her younger brother Liam as he prepared for school without needing to speak. Yet something had shifted within her, subtle and unspoken, like the feeling of waking up in a place where the light falls differently through the window. She prepared his lunch, combed his hair, and walked him down to the front gate of their apartment building, her thoughts drifting back to the day before, to the way Nathaniel had listened without interrupting, the way his presence felt less like a stranger's and more like someone who had been living in the corners of her memory all along. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, had not expected a continuation of what she assumed was a temporary escape, a singular moment carved out of grief and nostalgia. But when she arrived at work later that day, there was another envelope waiting for her in her locker. Inside was a folded piece of paper, no name, no formal greeting, just a line of familiar handwriting that read, "Would you like to visit one more place with me?" and beneath that a time and an address. She almost crumpled the note and left it there, but curiosity bloomed again like it had before, not loud or urgent, but steady, and it pulled her toward the place without resistance. When she arrived, she found herself standing outside a small community art center tucked between two weathered brownstones in the south end, its windows painted with murals of dancing children and blooming flowers, the kind of place that had known love and history in equal measure. He was waiting inside, near the back, seated on a wooden bench beneath a row of skylights that poured soft light across the floor. He didn't stand when he saw her. He only smiled faintly and motioned to the seat beside him. She joined him without a word, the silence between them warm and familiar. After a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, the edges soft from age, The color faded slightly but still clear. It showed a group of children gathered around a woman seated at an easel, her head turned slightly to the side, laughing as one of the children held up a brush, too large for their hands. Ava's breath caught before she could understand why. Her eyes scanned the photo quickly, then returned to the woman. Her features were softer than in the press photos, more alive, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, her blouse smudged with color. But it was the smile that hit her hardest, a smile Ava hadn't remembered until that moment. "I've been here?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not recently. A long time ago?" Nathaniel nodded once. "She used to volunteer here every other Saturday, never told anyone. It was just something she did. She said this place made her feel useful, grounded." Ava leaned in closer, her hand brushing the photo's corner. "I think I knew her. I didn't know her name, but I remember her hands, the way she held the brush, and her voice. She used to hum while she painted." Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked, as if seen past everything that had once separated them. "Grace mentioned you once," he said, his tone measured. "She didn't use your name, but she described a girl who drew without looking at the paper, who used shadows instead of lines, who said she saw emotions as shapes. She said that girl had eyes full of silence." Ava blinked, her heart thudding in her chest. "I stopped drawing after she stopped coming. I didn't know why she left. One week she was there, and the next, everything felt quieter." "She died 3 weeks later," Nathaniel said, not cruelly, not dramatically, just as a truth that had lived in his bones too long. "She collapsed on a flight back from Paris. I never got to say goodbye." For a moment, the room seemed to still around them, the air heavy but not suffocating. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out her sketchbook, flipping to a page she had drawn weeks ago, maybe months, she wasn't sure. It showed a woman sitting on a bench, surrounded by children, her smile turned to the sky. She handed it to him, and his hands trembled as he took it. "I think I was trying to remember her," Ava said, her voice tight. "Even when I didn't know that's what I was doing." He studied the sketch, his breath shallow, his fingers tracing the outline of the figure. "You remembered her better than I ever could." Neither of them spoke after that for several minutes. The only sound was the creaking of the old wooden floor as the light shifted across the room. When he finally looked at her again, there was something new in his eyes, something less guarded. "She believed in echoes," he said. "Said that some people leave behind sounds that only certain hearts can hear." Ava swallowed, her throat dry. "Maybe she left you the echo. Maybe she left me the melody." They left the center together just as the afternoon light began to dim, and Nathaniel led her 2 blocks north to a quiet street lined with brownstones and leafless trees. He stopped in front of a small shop with fogged windows and unlocked the door. Inside was a space Ava hadn't known existed, part studio, part archive, the walls lined with canvases and shelves filled with sketchbooks. The room smelled of dust and faint jasmine. He lit a small lamp and handed her a folded cloth from one of the drawers. When she opened it, she found another photo, this one of Grace sitting on the same rooftop garden they had visited days before, her hand resting on the bench beside her. "I thought I had lost all of these," Nathaniel said, watching her reaction. "But I found this one last night, tucked inside a book she had hidden behind others." Ava ran her fingers along the image, feeling the grain of the photo paper, the way the moment had been captured in stillness. Then, almost without thinking, she reached into her own bag and pulled out a small charm she had been carrying for years, a crescent moon carved from wood, worn down at the edges. She had found it at a thrift store when she was 16, drawn to it for reasons she had never been able to explain. Nathaniel stared at it, frozen. "Grace wore one exactly like that," he said. "She gave it away to a girl at the center the week before she died. She said the girl reminded her of hope." Ava closed her hand around the charm, tears threatening to rise, but held just beneath the surface. "She gave this to me. I kept it all these years without knowing why." He stepped closer then, his voice a whisper again. I think she knew. I think she left you pieces of herself to carry forward. The room around them seemed to hum, filled with memories that belonged to both of them and yet neither entirely. In that moment, time felt suspended, not lost or wasted, but paused, as if the world were waiting for them to breathe it back into motion. He didn't reach for her hand. She didn't move toward him, but between them was something undeniable, something not born of romance or convenience, but recognition, a soul remembering another. As they stood in the quiet studio, Ava realized the drawings she had made over the years, the ones she thought were born from dreams or shadows, had all led to this moment, to this person, to this truth. Not just that she had known Grace, but that Grace had seen something in her worth passing on, and Nathaniel, broken but healing, had been meant to find her not as a replacement, but as a reminder that some bonds exist beyond understanding, shaped by scent and memory, and the quiet persistence of those who never stopped listening. The days that followed their discovery were quieter than before, not silent, but slowed in a way that made everything feel more deliberate, as if each moment demanded to be fully felt before passing. Ava returned to her usual routine at the hotel, still reporting for shifts, still folding towels and wiping mirrors, but now she moved with a strange kind of weight, the kind that comes not from fatigue but from carrying something that matters. Nathaniel did not call for her, did not leave another note, and for a while she wondered if that afternoon in the studio had been the end of something instead of the beginning. Still, there was no bitterness in her waiting, only a cautious sense of stillness, as though she were standing at the edge of a place she had never dared to enter. She didn't expect the whispers, though, not at first. But they came, quiet at first, like they always do, then louder, like weeds growing through cracks in concrete. She heard them in the break room when no one thought she was listening, in the elevator when the doors hadn't closed fast enough, from guests who asked why the girl from the housekeeping staff had been seen talking to the man upstairs. The rumors were predictable. She was ambitious, manipulative, maybe sleeping her way up the ladder. She heard one woman say, with a sneer in her voice, that Ava had probably made up the whole story about the chemical spill just to sneak into the suite. Another one scoffed that no maid with a real sense of decency would dare take a bath in a billionaire's room unless she was planning to be noticed. Ava tried to ignore it, kept her head down, kept cleaning, but the words clung to her skin more stubbornly than the bleach ever had. They made her feel dirty in a different way, not because they were true, but because they were cruel. And because part of her, the part that still remembered the sting of being abandoned in foster care, wanted to believe them, that maybe she had done something wrong, even if she didn't know what. By the third day, she couldn't bring herself to go near the top floors anymore. She skipped them on her rotation, traded shifts when she could, anything to avoid the possibility of running into Nathaniel and seeing that he too might have heard the stories. On the fifth day, she opened her locker and found a letter inside. No envelope, just her name written across the top of the page in looping script. She unfolded it slowly, her hands trembling. It was short. You were never invisible to me, not once. But if this is too heavy, I'll carry it alone. You don't have to explain anything. You just have to be honest with yourself. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it into the sketchbook she kept tucked at the bottom of her backpack. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table long after Liam had gone to bed, the letter in one hand and a half-finished drawing in the other, staring at both as if they might begin to speak. And when the morning came, she didn't go to work. Instead, she opened her email and typed out her resignation. It was polite, professional, only a few lines long. No complaints, no emotion, just a quiet thank you and a final goodbye. She dropped her badge at the front desk without waiting for questions and walked out into the drizzle of a gray morning without looking back. It felt strange at first, like she was abandoning something that had never truly been hers. but also like shedding a skin that no longer fit. For a week she stayed home, took care of her brother, sketched without direction, and listened to the silence. She didn't expect him to come. She had tried to erase herself from his world, convinced that it would be easier for him to return to his grief without the complication of her presence. But Nathaniel Gray was not a man who retreated when something mattered. He waited 3 days before showing up, standing in the rain outside the bookstore where Ava had picked up her favorite charcoal pencils since she was 16. She saw him through the window, didn't believe it at first, but when he raised his hand in a soft wave, she stepped outside. He didn't bring flowers or apologies. He only said, "I don't care what they said. I only care what you feel." She stared at him, unsure of how to hold so many emotions at once, then asked quietly, "Why didn't you stop it?" He shook his head, eyes full of something more vulnerable than guilt. "Because I thought you needed space to choose for yourself, not to be protected by me, but to decide whether I was something worth staying for." Her breath caught in her chest. She hated that it made sense. She hated even more that it felt fair. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded flyer. It was a proposal, an idea, a project. A community art initiative called Wounds and Hope, a space where artists from all walks of life could submit work about pain and healing, to be curated into a gallery experience that would rotate through city spaces. And at the bottom of the flyer was her name, not as a participant, but as the lead curator. Ava looked up, her mouth open in shock. "This isn't real." He smiled gently. "It's already funded. The only thing missing is you." She didn't answer right away. She stared at the flyer as if trying to decide whether her hands were steady enough to hold it. "Why me?" she whispered. Nathaniel didn't blink. "Because you carry things most people ignore. Because you feel deeply and draw honestly. Because you reminded me of everything I thought I had lost. And because Grace would have chosen you. I'm just catching up." Her knees almost gave out at the mention of Grace. She blinked hard, trying to stop the heat rising behind her eyes. "What if I fail?" she asked. "You won't," he said. "But even if you do, at least it'll be honest." That night, she stayed up late, drafting her first ideas. She didn't know what she was building exactly, only that it mattered. The work gave her purpose. The purpose gave her peace. The whispers faded with time, as they always do, replaced by headlines about the upcoming launch, by articles about the unexpected collaboration between one of Boston's most elusive billionaires and a young, unknown artist with a past as complex as her work. But the noise outside never mattered as much as the quiet inside. The stillness she found each time she walked into the warehouse space where the gallery was taking shape. She spent hours there, organizing sketches, selecting pieces, meeting with contributors, many of whom had never shown their work to anyone before. Some were children, some were women from shelters, some were veterans. All of them had been broken in their own ways, and Ava saw each one clearly. She hung their pain like portraits, not to expose them, but to honor them. Nathaniel visited often, but never hovered. He watched from a distance, helped when needed, and when he saw her across the room, she knew he wasn't looking at her with pity or desire or even awe. He was looking at her like someone who had found something he thought was lost and now simply wanted to keep it safe. On the night before the exhibit opened, Ava stood alone in the gallery, staring at the final piece she had mounted herself. It was one of her own, the one she hadn't planned to include. A child curled up in a bathtub, steam rising around her, a bottle of jasmine soap on the ledge, and in the background, the faint outline of a man standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow, but his posture familiar. She stared at it for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself, the air quiet except for the distant hum of city lights. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt him beside her. He said nothing for a long while, then softly, "She would have loved this?" Ava nodded, her voice too thick to reply. "You didn't take a bath in that suite by mistake," he continued, his tone low and steady. You walked into a place neither of us had dared to return to, and because you did, I can finally breathe in it again." She turned to look at him, really look, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, she allowed herself to believe that maybe the universe hadn't made a mistake. Maybe it had been guiding them both, through grief and silence and scent and memory, toward something neither of them could have imagined but both had needed all along. And standing there in the stillness, Ava Clark let herself begin to trust that she had not simply stepped into someone else's life by accident. She had been seen. She had been chosen. And now she had chosen too. The day the gallery opened to the public, the city felt different, not louder or busier, but somehow more alert, as if something beneath the surface had shifted without permission. The sun pushed through clouds that had threatened rain all week, and the streets outside the converted warehouse buzzed with voices unfamiliar to Ava. People in tailored coats and glossy heels, carrying cameras and notepads, and the kind of curiosity that usually came with ego. But inside, in the gallery she had built from silent nights and fragile hopes, the world moved slower, softer, almost reverent. The walls were lined with stories, not written in paragraphs or printed on plaques, but drawn in color and shape and shadow, each piece holding something more than skill or beauty, each one a memory, cracked open and left to breathe. Ava moved quietly through the space, dressed simply in black, her silver name tag barely visible. She stopped every now and then to adjust a frame, to guide a child toward their own painting, to speak softly with visitors who didn't know what to say after standing in front of certain images. One woman cried in silence before a charcoal drawing of a house with one window lit and three dark. A man stared for almost 10 minutes at a sketch of a soldier lying flat on a field of paper cranes. A teenager clutched the corner of their hoodie while looking at their own painting of a mother holding a mirror instead of a baby. No one laughed. No one whispered. The air was still, charged with something that had no name. In the center of the space, directly opposite the entrance, hung Ava's piece. It had no title. It was the one she had added last, the one she hadn't planned to include until Nathaniel found it resting beside the elevator 2 nights earlier and asked her simply, "Why hide the truth?" She had answered without thinking, "Because it was mine." He hadn't pressed her further. Instead, he said, "Maybe someone else needs it too." The piece showed a girl curled into a bathtub, water sloshing gently at the edge, steam blurring the lines of her hair and shoulders. Her eyes were closed, her body drawn with trembling grace, and above her hung the trace of scent, white jasmine rising like smoke. In the doorway stood the shadow of a man, tall and silent, one hand at his side, the other reaching forward as if remembering how to hold something and not crush it. Behind him, light spilled through the hallway, painting the edge of his coat in warmth. There were no faces, only feeling, and it was enough. People paused in front of the piece longer than any other. Some asked about the artist. Some asked about the story. Most simply stared, like they were waiting to understand something they had buried long ago. Nathaniel arrived late, slipping in through the side entrance, not with fanfare or speeches, but with the quiet presence that had become his way. He wore no tie, no press badge, only a watch on his left wrist that used to belong to Grace. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone no longer trying to be recognized, pausing beside Ava only briefly, their eyes meeting without words. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew he saw everything. Later that evening, after the final wave of guests had left and the lights had dimmed to a soft amber, Ava sat cross-legged in the far corner of the gallery, surrounded by leftover programs and the soft echoes of praise that no longer felt like noise. Her fingers brushed the fabric of her jeans as she stared at the main piece, not proud, not afraid, just present. She heard his footsteps before he spoke. He didn't sit. He stood beside her, close enough to share the same breath but far enough to respect the quiet she had chosen. She would have stayed until the last candle burned out, he said, his voice low. Grace. She used to say that when people gave you their vulnerability, the least you could do was stay with it a little while. Ava nodded, eyes still on the painting. I think she's still here, in this room, in the air. He looked at her then, something soft flickering across his features. You gave her a second ending, one she never got to write. She turned to him, unsure whether to speak the question that had lived in her chest for weeks. When she finally did, it came out quieter than she intended. Why me, Nathaniel? Why not someone with experience, someone with a degree, someone who wouldn't have ruined the moment by being in the wrong place at the wrong time? He crouched down then, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. Because Grace believed that art should come from the people who felt the most and spoke the least. And because the moment you stepped into that bath, you didn't ruin anything. You returned something that had been missing. She smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to the floor. A mistake brought me into your life. A mistake brought her into mine too, he replied. She took the wrong train one day and ended up sitting beside me at a coffee shop. I spilled tea on her sketch pad. She was furious, but she came back the next day, just to see if I'd say sorry again. Ava's laughter was quiet but real. Sounds like the universe has a strange sense of humor, he tilted his head. Or maybe it just uses accidents to deliver people who were always meant to collide. For a moment, they said nothing. The silence wrapped around them like a blanket, not empty but full of everything they had left unsaid. Then he stood and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet pouch. He placed it gently in her palm without asking permission. Inside was a silver charm, shaped like a crescent moon, identical to the one she had carried for years, except this one had an engraving on the back, 2 letters, G and A. She carved it herself, he said, before she died. She said it belonged to someone who hadn't found her way yet. Ava clutched the charm, her eyes closing as warmth surged through her chest. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because the moment didn't need tears to be real. She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked, not as a man who had once owned everything and lost it, but as someone who had rebuilt something from the wreckage, brick by quiet brick. He didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he whispered, I want to walk beside you, Ava. Not ahead, not behind, just beside. She nodded, the charm still in her hand. That's all I've ever wanted. He helped her to her feet and they walked out together, the city outside washed in gold and blue, the night alive with possibilities they didn't need to name. They didn't talk much on the way back to her apartment. He offered to walk her to the door, and when they reached it, he turned and looked at her with the gentleness of someone who knew that love was not about grand gestures or declarations, but presence. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. Instead, he said softly, You reminded me that even grief can become something beautiful when it's shared. She touched his arm lightly, a promise in the gesture, and stepped inside. That night, as she lay in bed with the charm on the nightstand and the scent of jasmine still lingering in her hair, she dreamed not of shadows or silence, but of a garden where nothing ever withered, and the sound of laughter echoed long after the people had gone. In the weeks that followed, the gallery continued to grow. New submissions arrived every day. Letters poured in from people across the country, thanking her for building a space where they could feel less alone. Nathaniel helped behind the scenes, his name never used in press releases, his presence always quiet. Together they began planning the next exhibition, one focused not on wounds, but on rebuilding. They called it Echoes and Light. One afternoon, as Ava was hanging a new piece from a 10-year-old girl who had lost her parents in a fire, Nathaniel walked in, carrying a simple white envelope. He handed it to her and waited. Inside was a short note, handwritten in the same looping script as the very first message he had sent her. It read, Would you spend the rest of your days with me, even if we only get one at a time? She looked up, her heart thudding gently, and smiled. Yes, she said. One at a time is more than enough. A full year passed before either of them realized it, not because the days were hurried or blurred, but because each one had been lived with intention, with quiet choices and shared breaths, and the kind of honesty that didn't require dramatic words to be understood. Ava no longer thought of herself as invisible, not because the world had changed its gaze, but because she had stopped shrinking under it. She walked differently now, spoke more clearly, looked people in the eye when they asked about her work. She no longer apologized for being present, for taking up space, for choosing her own path, even when it was one she had to clear herself. The gallery had grown into something more than art and walls. It had become a refuge, a place where silence was not treated as absence but as language, where grief and hope were painted side by side, and no one was expected to explain their tears. Ava curated the stories of others with the care of someone who knew what it meant to be misunderstood. She read every submission, answered every letter, and met each artist with the same patience Grace had once shown her when she was just a quiet child, afraid of her own voice. Nathaniel remained a constant, not hovering, not distant, just there, the way some people become a part of your days without ever having to claim them. He built spaces for the community to gather, funded projects without his name attached, and volunteered on weekends under a nickname only the children knew. There were no press conferences, no magazine spreads, no speeches about legacy or giving back, just a man who had found something worth staying for and chose to show up again and again, one ordinary day at a time. On the anniversary of the first gallery launch, they hosted a new exhibition titled What We Carry. The walls were filled with pieces about memory, about the weight and gift of what we hold close. At the center of the room, Ava unveiled a piece of her own, larger than anything she had ever attempted before. It depicted two figures sitting on a bench in a quiet rooftop garden, shoulders touching, the city skyline behind them, the sky above painted not in blue or gray, but in warm streaks of lavender and gold. Between them, on the bench, lay a small velvet pouch and an open sketchbook, its pages caught mid-flutter by a soft breeze. The figures were faceless but unmistakable, not because of their detail but because of their presence, the way they leaned toward each other, not out of need but out of understanding. The crowd moved through the gallery in respectful silence, some pausing, some crying, but most simply breathing deeper, as if reminded that it was okay to feel everything at once and still be whole. When the lights dimmed and the final guests left, Ava and Nathaniel stood in the center of the room, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, his hand gently resting on her back. They didn't need to speak. The space between them was full of everything that had ever mattered. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, horns and footsteps and voices weaving together into the fabric of another night. But inside, time moved differently, softly, like a memory you wanted to keep close. Ava looked up at him, a small smile curving at the edge of her lips, and whispered the words she had once written in the margins of her sketchbook, when she still believed no one would ever see them. Sometimes the wrong door opens to the right story. He smiled back and whispered in return, and sometimes the right person walks through it anyway.